Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here in these multiple different forms of technology. Some of you are joining us live in our sanctuary. Many will be on live stream, and Professor Heschel will be, as you can see, joining us via Zoom. This is our first experience of doing it this way, and so please be understanding of how we do the best we can. It is also a great honor for me that the first scholar in residence to be with us during this year of my retirement is Dr. Susannah Heschel. Professor Heschel has been with Sukkot Shalom a number of times before, generally in person, last year by Zoom, and once more she is joining us here. It means a great deal to me that she has agreed to honor me in this way. For those of you joining us from home, we'll also have an opportunity to ask questions by posing them in the chat room. You can do that during the session, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies and Chair of the Jewish Studies Department at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. She has been an incredible force in the academic world and in social policy issues. Much of her work was in Jewish partisan thought of the 19th and 20th century. Her books include Abraham Geiger, The Jewish Jesus, which won the National Jewish Book Award and was, I think, the first book that she talked about in her scholarship at Sukkot Shalom. She also wrote The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany, and very importantly, wrote on being a Jewish feminist. She was the editor of Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, the essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel, which as a congregation, many of us had the opportunity to study together. She has won many awards and honors and grants, visiting professor at the University of Frankfurt and at Cape Town University and at Princeton. She has won Ford and Carnegie Foundation awards, Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship at the National Humanities Center, Guggenheim Fellow for History and European Jewish Scholarship of Islam. She has served with me on committees of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. And I personally was touched to be present at the 2016 annual dinner of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington when the 2016 Elie Wiesel Award was presented to Congressman John Lewis of blessed memory. Professor Heschel made that presentation. So I want to start by quoting from Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, someone who Abraham Joshua Heschel worked with. Niebuhr wrote, "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in one lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love." Professor Heschel, looking at the words of Niebuhr, that anything that really matters can't be done in a single generation, and anything that really matters can't be done singly, alone. How do you see your work, as well as the work of your father, intersecting in a way that creates an enduring, abiding legacy?
Well, that's a big question, but let me first say what a pleasure it is to be with you and with your congregation. I have always enjoyed my visits to Chicago to be with you and your synagogue and just our friendship. I am grateful for our friendship. And my father had a wonderful friendship with Reinhold Niebuhr. I actually just published an article about their relationship. I think my initial response to the quotation would be to refer to my teaching, because in the classroom, I'm conveying to a younger generation. And it's that transmission from one generation to the next that's very stimulating. And I don't see it as one way coming from me to them, but very much in two directions, because I learn from them the way they think. They do have different questions, they think differently, and it's incredibly stimulating to me to hear how they think and to realize actually that there's so many fresh new ways to look at the world. So yes, the transmission, the transmission is in the classroom a wonderful gift. But it's also true what Niebuhr said. It's not something one does alone. And in fact, so in my own chosen career, profession, which I would say is actually a vocation rather than a job, meaning it absorbs all of my life, day and night, every day, is to think about ideas and how we can improve the way we live by thinking differently, by changing the culture in good, helpful ways. I think about the problem of the resentment and grievance, the feelings of grievance that pervade the United States right now. And I've just been wondering, what do we have to offer from Judaism that might do something to change that mood? And you and I talked about that briefly last week. As you recall, we were talking about resentment and Jonah and Job, remember?
Indeed, we had a wonderful opportunity that came my way and my wife Patty's way to be in Dartmouth last week and to be with you in person.
That was great.
And we had a wonderful time and wonderful conversations. One of the things we talked about was, and now as I'm planning for retirement, looking back at my 40 years of being a rabbi, of being ordained from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1980, a very different time, and HUC and the Reform movement was very different at that time. And particularly studying the work of your father and in moral grandeur and spiritual audacity, one of the great gifts that your father brought to American Judaism was an intellectual level of understanding mysticism and Hasidism, which of course was not terribly welcome at Hebrew Union College, even though Hebrew Union College was the place where he was able to come to America, escape from Nazism. But it was not a welcoming place because at that time, Reform Judaism did not see mysticism, and certainly not Hasidism, as legitimate expressions of Judaism. And so, as we know, Sam Dresner, Richard Rubinstein, and others followed him to JTS and New York, where he was much more welcomed. Interestingly, the role that that spirituality now plays in American Judaism across the board, across the denominations, that has really been transformative in Jewish thought in America. And it's transformative particularly, I think, for a younger generation. While there are those who worry about the future of American Judaism, when we look at the impact of this deeper understanding that is more compelling, more inspirational, and transformational, how working particularly within the university world, do you see that tradition deeply touching those who now are influenced by it?
Yes, well, You've covered a lot. I first want to just say that my father's life was saved by Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. The president, Julian Morgenstern, managed to squeeze 5 visas out of the US State Department with great difficulty. And my father was one of the people who came over on an HUC visa. And he came to the United States in March of 1940. And yes, it was very difficult for him at HUC for many reasons, including the fact that he was desperately worried about his mother and 3 of his sisters who were still in Europe, and many friends and relatives. But it wasn't any different in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary. There was hostility toward the entire range, this huge range of Jewish mystical and spiritual traditions, including Hasidism. There was no interest in that. I would add to that that, by the way, Yiddish as a language was also held in contempt. When I was a child, I was told you have to say Shabbat Shalom, Hebrew. Don't say Good Shabbos to the faculty. A certain faculty didn't like that. So, and I think also in the handbook for rabbis, it said if parents have a newborn, you should discourage them from giving the child a Yiddish name. The child should have a Hebrew name, which is a kind of, I don't know what to say, a kind of Jewish self-loathing. This is who we are. This is part of who we are. Our identity as Jews. Why would we want to give that up? Why are we somehow ashamed of it? But that's in part the heritage of German Jewish thought. And what makes my father so extraordinary is the way he brought Hasidic ideas into his theological writings. Often people don't know, in fact, that there is a Hasidic teaching behind a statement that he's making, because he does it in a subtle way. Martin Buber does it too, but much more upfront. He just discusses Hasidism and presents it, which was really fabulous that he did that, of course. But with my father, he doesn't have to talk about Hasidism explicitly. It's there implicitly. And yes, I think people were very, very moved, and it changed American Judaism in profound ways, in good ways. There were others also, by the way, who contributed. I would mention Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Shlomo Karlebach, and others as well. But certainly the mood was there.
Well, I think he was certainly in the forefront of that move. And with the 60s and 70s and even Eastern spirituality, which, of course, Reb Zalman really brought in, it represented a revitalization. I should also say that as grateful as you are to HUC and to Dr. Morgenstern for saving your father and mother met in my uncle's house.
Yes.
And so they were introduced to each other in my uncle's living room. So I think he was grateful for that opportunity as well. And as important as your father's work in mysticism and intellectual thought was also as an activist that he is so well known. And that activism was also transformational in American Judaism and American culture. Last year, many of us watched the documentary by Dr. Sherry Rogers called Shared Legacies about the Black-Jewish alliance and the civil rights era. It included a great deal of footage of your father, Martin Luther King Jr., Julian Bond. It talked about the martyrs of that time, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and the saints as well. And your father's memory is constantly invoked when we talk about the civil rights movement. And this documentary was about the Jewish-Black alliance that really pushed that civil rights movement. And we know today that there are tensions and accusations. People want to have litmus tests of loyalty, of perfect statements. How concerned are you about that, and how do you see us perhaps getting back to a time when we have a shared commitment to social justice and particularly civil rights in America?
Well, again, you're asking a huge question.
Well, the idea is that I ask huge questions so that you get to talk and enlighten us with your insights.
Okay, let me first just come back to your initial comment about my parents meeting in the home of your uncle, Jacob Marcus. And I just want to say they didn't just meet. They were fixed up by your aunt, Mrs. Marcus. She made a shidduch, nice, good Jewish thing to do, and it worked. So, and I hope that we all engage as shadchans. I love to do that. Okay, let me just say that there are a few things that I find particularly striking about the civil rights movement, my father's involvement. I want to first say that I'm deeply moved that whenever I meet someone from the civil rights movement, they hug me. They're loving to me. They tell me how grateful they are for my father. And I am struck by that because, it tells us the movement of nonviolence took months and months of training. And it was a training that meant not simply that if someone hits you, you don't hit back. It was a training of the mind and the heart to make you a different kind of person. And that's what I find extraordinary. They are different people, that after 60 years, 70 years, to express gratitude like that, it's very special. So my father's relationships also were warm and profound on a deep level. When he met Dr. King in 1963 in Chicago, by the way, they immediately felt a connection and started working together and planning things, giving lectures together. And the same was true of others, including Jesse Jackson, whom I first met in my father's office at the seminary when I was just a kid in school. And Jesse Jackson then had started Operation Breadbasket, and my father had gotten involved with him in that. And again, Jesse Jackson has just celebrated his 80th birthday. Over the years, he has been so warm to me, so kind, and so many others, Andrew Young, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who I think he was a holy person, an amazing person. But yes, there was a commitment together to justice. It was rooted in the Bible, that's true, and they had a way of thinking in biblical terms that was very special. What they could bring out from the Bible that would be helpful, that would soften hardened hearts. What could they do? That was the question. And so, how can we recapture that today? That's your question, yes?
Yes. How do we get back to that and share a vision, particularly, and you can go even deeper in terms of our real concern about where America is right now and the polarization, the divisions, not so much between blacks and Jews, but we share, I think the black community and the Jewish community share a concern about where America is right now. And how do we work in coalition with each other, even though there are those who, in some ways, seek division because of those litmus tests of that people are being judged on very narrow kinds of ways. I'll let you kind of respond to that.
Yeah, I remember when, I think it was the summer of 2015, Hillel Cohen had invited to teach at Dartmouth. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Zionism at Hebrew University and a great historian. And the platform of the Black Lives Matter movement had come out and had something about endorsing BDS, and various Jewish organizations were saying, we won't talk to those people ever. And I told this to Hillel Cohen, and he said, that's precisely whom you have to talk to. Why just talk to people who agree with you? So that's one thing. Of course, the question of Israel and how we speak about Israel is crucial. I think we tend to talk about the Black community as if there's a unified community, which there isn't any more than there's no unified Jewish community, much as some people would like to pretend or wish they could somehow create. It's not going to happen. The polarization is certainly there. I think it's perhaps more severe in the Jewish community than it is within the Black community in America. I do think we've gone through something, a kind of national reckoning and engagement and thinking about issues of racism in a very intense way during the pandemic in response to the murder of George Floyd. And that's been very important. And I actually do think people have changed a bit. And then there's the younger generation. It's completely different, completely different. Issues that we might even want to debate at our age, for them, it's nothing to debate. It's clear cut. It's what they take for granted. And that's wonderful. So certain kinds of, I remember this also when I was a student, there were certain things that were just so obvious. Gay and lesbian issues were so obvious. The older generation was discussing, is it a sin? Is it a sickness? All kinds of crazy things. We just ignored them and created something new and succeeded. So I'm hoping that actually we are moving forward. And I think we have a very activist younger generation right now. Now, what's the problem on the Jewish side? There are serious problems, in fact. I am aware of that. Some of it comes, and I just say from my own experience on college campuses, we have students from all over the world now in a way that didn't exist 30 years ago. And students who are coming from parts of the world where they haven't been thinking about racism or about gay and lesbian rights or about anti-Semitism. And in fact, in the classroom, students will say things that can be quite shocking about Jews. In some cases, it's because that's what they have been hearing, and they don't really know that this is anti-Semitic because they're so accustomed to it. In some cases, it stems, and I would say usually from a left-wing orientation rather than a right-wing among the students, but the right is also there, as we know. And it does worry me. I do think that there is a resurgence of anti-Semitic images, ideas about Jews and money, for example. The problem is that some of this is promoted even at the highest level, that is, people running for US Congress. As Republicans, you might have heard about this in Cincinnati against a Jewish opponent, and then putting out posters with the Jewish opponent's nose elongated and with dollar bills or dollar bill signs around the poster and so on. I find that shocking. People worry about Facebook monitoring itself, and I think it should, but I would say that the US government also has to monitor itself. I don't think it's a question of free speech, it's a question of dignity. I make it clear my classroom is a place where we speak in a certain way. It's not the kind of conversation we would have at a restaurant or in a dorm lounge sitting around. Classroom is a special place. And it's not about free speech. It's about speaking in ways that are appropriate to the academic endeavor and speaking in language that's appropriate for the academy. So then comes the other question, which is, what do we do when critiques of Israeli politics turn into blaming Jews somehow, turn into racist arguments, racist anti-Semitism? That's how Jews are. Or claims that are not true about Israel is committing genocide. Some of it is a certain slipperiness. Murder is murder. Trying to deny someone the right to speak or the validity of someone's culture, et cetera, calling that cultural genocide diminishes the seriousness of murder. And so that's some of what we face also. That Palestinian culture is suppressed by Israel, perhaps that's a legitimate claim, but calling it cultural genocide crosses a line that's unacceptable. Now, what do we do when it's not coming from students, but from my fellow faculty colleagues, from colleagues who insist on putting out statements condemning Israel and say nothing about what's happening to the Uyghurs? We just heard from a man from China who was involved in torturing and killing Uyghurs in China now. Why don't we say something? Why don't we object to our universities having overseas campuses in China, for example, and only object about Israel, calling for an academic boycott of Israel, when it's actually, if anything, the academics in Israel who are doing the most to try to make Israel a more equitable society for Arabs and for all. So I would say, I think that the people who are running our Jewish organizations that have an enormous amount of money, enormous budgets, enormous, they're doing a very bad job. I don't think they understand what's going on, and I don't think they're helping. I have to say, I have a lot of respect for much of what the ADL does, but anti-Semitism is getting worse. So maybe we have to say perhaps the ADL is not doing what it should be doing. Maybe it's on the wrong track. I don't know. Let's think about it. And the same with the American Jewish Committee, perhaps. Perhaps Hillel is not doing a good job. Perhaps they should try something different. I don't think Hillel is doing a good job on addressing what's going on college campuses. It's objecting, but it's not addressing some of the problems that do exist. So those are some of my responses.
Well, thank you. It's extraordinarily helpful.
One last thing, though, about this, which is one of the things that really bothers me, is there's so much about anti-Semitism that's going around all the time with Jews. And I sometimes have a feeling, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's true in some circles within the Jewish world, that when you say there is a huge amount of anti-Semitism, makes some Jews happy. It makes them feel that you are a good Jew for seeing a lot of anti-Semitism. So why are we wallowing in this anti-Semitism? There's so much more to being a Jew. And yet that seems to be the focus. We had a speaker last year on campus at Dartmouth who talked about Israel and Israel's response to anti-Semitism. And finally I said, well, what's good that Israel is giving the world, that its existence gives the world? But she had no answer. So this frustrates me. That's all.
Well, we could go into a number of the things you spoke about, but just this last piece about Israel, some of that narrative of we are surrounded by enemies and by anti-Semites who hate us, that narrative was something that Bibi Netanyahu was raised with from his father and from an intellectual school, that there were two schools, and as my uncle Jacob Marcus, as well as I think Salo Baran, called it the lachrymose school of Jewish history, that everything in Jewish history, that group saw everything in Jewish history as enemies and disasters, and there is a part of Israeli political thinking that is based on that, and American Jewish thinking. No one ever went broke trying to raise money on the issue of Jews needing self-protection.
Right.
But there's another critique that you have of Jewish leadership, particularly in America, and that is a feminist critique. Where are the women? And when are those institutions fighting for women's rights and Jewish women's rights? And I think that's something that you've raised significantly, and you may want to talk about.
Well, yes, thank you. And I actually have just written a book with Sarah Imhoff, who teaches at Indiana University, called Jewish Studies and the Woman Question. It's a feminist critique of the field of Jewish studies, and that should be out in a year. Let me just say that I'll give you some examples. Fine, I went to a conference that was paid for by the Jewish Federation in Boston. They were all men. All the speakers were men. 2.5 days it went on. And I went to the head of the director of the Federation. I said, look, in the future, why don't you include, we're giving you this grant, would you please strive to achieve gender parity? He brushed me off and walked away. Not interested. All right. So these are basic things that you find everywhere nowadays. That is, it's certainly at universities, if you apply for a grant and so on, it goes without saying. But let's think about some of the problems. So in Israel, there are 2 women who are professors of Talmud at 2 different universities. And one of the problems getting a job, the only 2 women, is that many of the people who want to get a PhD in the study of Talmud are men, religious men, and they don't want to study with a woman professor. So the women won't get hired because if they're hired by the department won't attract as many graduate students. So these are just some of the ways in which these gender dynamics enter in. Now that's a question of religious, and the first example, the Federation is not a religious organization. There's no reason it can't demand that when it gives a grant that there be some kind of gender parity, at least, if not complete equality, I would say. There are questions also of course, of harassment. What do we do about harassment and discrimination? There are laws, certainly on campus we have Title IX, but Title IX is really for the protection of the university, not the protection of the victim. So that's a problem. In Israel, they've actually developed some very interesting methods. So in the university, women alert other women to the men who are not going to be respectful of them as professors and who are known to be harassers and who are going to give them a hard time. And they alert and warn women about these men. They also have a hotline so that if a woman has been harassed or assaulted on campus, she calls the hotline and there's a community, and they call themselves a women's community that surround her, that help her, take care of her, and so on. In Israel, in addition, there is a wonderful poet, Mirav Zohar, who has started a village for women who have been raped. They can go to the village, stay as long as they need to. It's women only, in order to heal. So I think Israel is a very creative place, even though they also have, of course, the same problems we have. But I think it would be wonderful in the United States for, at least for the Jewish community, if not for all communities, to have a place where women can go if they've been assaulted. Now, the problem with discrimination and harassment and assault is that there are some things that sort of fall in between. And one of them is exclusion, excluding women from the conversation. Women who are not invited to give a keynote lecture, even though they've written the most important book on the subject, or women students who are not included with the male graduate students who go out for lunch every day with the male professor. There's certain ways women are excluded from the kinds of informal conversations that are really essential, essential for a career, essential just for feeling accepted in a person's life. There are there are also ways in which sometimes we don't take these things seriously enough. Sometimes we ignore remarks that are made in passing, little gestures, and we don't realize that in some sense it's a pyramid. These little things accumulate, but they grow. They grow and they grow. The little put down. So there was a woman, a professor of women's studies at Merrimack College, an Israeli woman, Simona Sharoni, who was at a conference and got in the elevator, and there were some other people in the elevator, and she was near the buttons. And she said, well, what floor do you want? And the senior male professor, who was surrounded by his male disciples, said, ladies' lingerie. You know, you don't say that in an academic setting. You don't say that when women are still struggling to be taken seriously, to be respected, when those kinds of sexist comments really, they feel crushing. They feel, oh no, now I have to put up with that again. She actually informed the academic organization what had transpired, and they said, yeah, they wrote to him and said, you should apologize. Instead, he went to the media, and the next thing you know, she was getting death threats. And sometimes it's not what is said, but the backlash that's frightening. That there is so much hatred and contempt for women. It's, you open the Pandora's box and it all comes out. A woman says, don't talk like that. And the next thing you know, death threats. So yeah, there's a lot to be done.
Well, as I think you know, Congregation Sukkot Shalom was founded kind of in response to the continuity industry that grew up in the 1990s after the Jewish population study that showed the high percentage of intermarriage in America, and there were those who did everything they possibly could to try to inoculate young people from marrying people they wanted to marry. Because they were inoculating them because this was a disease that they were afraid of. And that continuity industry was led by, I would say, 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman, largely. But in the last couple years, as part of the Me Too movement, one of those scholars who was the gatekeeper for other young scholars getting jobs and so forth, was basically outed. And he was, if not the CEO of the continuity industry, he was certainly a senior vice president. And then a critique was raised that, in fact, the whole intermarriage crisis was an anti-feminist issue, that Jewish women needed to have more Jewish babies, and that's what the in-marriage was about. You're in Boston, you know these people, and you've been at plenty of these conferences as well. How do you respond to the role that that continuity crisis was also an anti-feminist movement?
Wow, well, I do actually know all the people who were involved in that scandal, which was outrageous, that this man had been assaulting women for decades, and they were afraid to say anything because they thought it would ruin their careers. And he was, in fact, giving jobs to women and helping women. And so that was his sort of cover for this. And finally, he was outed. And now there were efforts to rehabilitate him. And that's another question that one could discuss, question of what constitutes forgiveness and rehabilitation. I don't. So the continuity issue, I don't know, I'm a little allergic to the word, but the problem is, why is it an anti-feminist movement? The problem is that it started at a time just exactly when women were beginning to enter professions, when women were starting to go to graduate school, medical school, law school, business school, and so on. That's when the Jewish community said, you need to have more children. But instead of providing daycare, subsidizing daycare, helping in some way, speaking in positive terms about women as professionals, instead, we heard the opposite, that this is not good, that you should wait, have children, you can go to graduate school when you're 50, and the kids are out of the house. Well, we weren't buying it. I can tell you, in addition, there were stereotypes of Jewish women that are still prevalent among young people. The Jap stereotype, for example. There were ways in which women, Jewish women, were demeaned, and Jewish men didn't want to marry a Jewish woman. They were, in a sense, taught to find Jewish women unattractive as spouses, as life partners. But apart from that, there's another issue, which is that it was always this kind of Noah syndrome, a husband and a wife, man and a woman. Well, what about all the women who were single and wanted to have children, who didn't want to have a partner, who wanted or who couldn't find a partner and wanted to have kids? What effort was made for them? What about gay couples, gay lesbian couples who wanted to have kids? What about the issue of adoption? You know, I started the Orange on the Seder plate years ago, and one day a young woman, a college student, said to me, I wish you would include Jewish children who've been adopted, because she said she just feels so stigmatized because she doesn't look Jewish. She comes from somewhere outside the US, whatever, she doesn't look Jewish. And in her own extended family, they look at her funny, etc. There's that issue. That wasn't part of it. So, yeah, I can tell you it took a long time and a long struggle for people of my generation to be able to get over some of the hostility that we experienced during those decades. It was pretty bad.
I was going to mention the Orange on the Seder plate as one of your legacies, but your legacy goes much deeper than that, but at least we know how broadly shared that tradition has become. Let's go back for a moment to Jesse Jackson's 80th birthday. You and I, because we were together in Hanover, taped a greeting to him on his 80th birthday. And again, there are those in the Jewish community who have created these litmus tests of perfect loyalty. And yet, as I told you, as many of you who are either watching online or who are here in the sanctuary remember that when the massacre happened at Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, and when Rabbi Daniels and Kenny created a wonderful service of all of the clergy of this community, Jesse Jackson came on his own to be present. And when his daughter Santita talked to me at one point, she said that Jesse Jackson insisted that all of his children read your father's book, The Prophets. And so your father's presence in the Jackson family remained very, very important. And so it's wonderful to hear you speak of that warm relationship, of that personal relationship that existed with your father and then with you as well, getting to know him. And I know how close he feels to you, lovingly. And so we need to continue to build those kinds of relationships among us. You talked about anti-Semitism.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, please.
Because, you know, I mentioned earlier the gratitude that's expressed to me by civil rights leaders for my father. But I want to say that we as a Jewish community ought to be expressing our gratitude for the civil rights movement, for what it did for our American Jews, young people, the inspiration that it gave us, the way the Bible came to life, the respect for the Hebrew Bible. Where are you going to find that in history? My father was in Nazi Germany, where the Protestant theologians said that the Old Testament is a Jewish book, throw it out of the Christian Bible, and they did. And Jesus was not a Jew, but an Aryan. And then he came to this country, and Dr. King and the civil rights leaders were quoting from the prophets, from the book of Exodus, not from the Gospels, but from the book of Exodus. Because why? Because they wanted to be inclusive. That's amazing. And because they love the Hebrew Bible the way we do. I think they love it and know it better than most Jews, unfortunately. We have a lot to be grateful for the civil rights movement, for what it did for us. And now about Jesse Jackson. You know, he said something one time that was unfortunate, and then he apologized for it before the whole world more than once. Now, where are you going to find someone who does that in the course of human history? First of all, if you want to talk about the history of anti-Semitism, that barely qualifies. But people said horrible things about Jews. But did people apologize for that? I don't know of it. And why can't we accept the apology? My black friends asked me, well, how come they don't accept it? He apologized. It's not right. In fact, it goes against Jewish law. You know, I signed that Harper's letter against cancel culture. When did that start? It started when there was a march in Washington in 1983 to commemorate the march. And Jesse Jackson was announced as one of about 30 different speakers. And all the Jewish organizations said, well, Jesse Jackson said, we're leaving, we won't come. And so they all pulled out except for New Jewish Agenda. That's cancel culture. And the Jews do it. I don't accept that. That's not right. And believe me, there's not one of us who hasn't said or done something highly inappropriate at one point. He apologized for something. That was nothing what he said. To call New York Hymietown, so what? That's nothing. You don't deprive, why we as Jews deprived ourselves of him? Because we wouldn't overlook that, wouldn't forgive that. We lost someone who was a great friend and a great ally, and we damaged ourselves. Ethically, morally, we damaged ourselves, as well as politically.
Well, as you know, he has been a great friend of this congregation as well, and we're deeply grateful for that. Let me conclude my interview with you by basically asking, what are you working on now? What are you writing? What are you working on? What is exciting to you right now?
Well, right now I'm, first of all, preparing a lecture that I'm giving in a week at Lehigh University on interfaith. And what I'm interested in is, where do we go from here? That is there an interfaith agenda for the 21st century? Because it seems to me we've been saying the same thing for many decades now, and it's time to think of new ideas and new things that we need to discuss. So that's one thing I'm working on, and then I'm going to Switzerland after that. I'm receiving an honorary doctorate at the University of Lucerne, and I have to give a speech, and it's also going to be about interfaith. And then at the same time, I'm writing something. It's really hard. I'm writing an article for a feshra for someone who is a scholar of Jacob Emden, who was a German Jewish Orthodox rabbi in the 18th century and who wrote very positive things about Christianity. And the question is why? And now historians have investigated, found out why. He wrote nice things about Christianity in order to win support from the Catholic bishops in Poland to suppress the Sabbatian heretics, the Frankists who were there. And okay, but what Emden wrote was really interesting because it was so positive. He said that Jesus came not to annul Jewish law in any way, but on the contrary, and that no one, not Jesus, the apostles Paul, no one tried to change Jewish law, but rather they said that it is for Jews and not for Gentiles. The Gentiles have to observe the 7 Noahide commandments, Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, and they will all go to heaven, to Olam Haba. And, by the way, Muslims. He said that Christians and Muslims, the 2 powers of the world, have been treating us pretty well, Jews. Emden says, we are not in Galut, in exile, now. Galut was when we were slaves in Egypt. That was Galut. But now we're free, we're treated well, and if we want to go to the land of Israel to live, we're free to do that. We can go there. And he's right. There was never any ban on Jews living in Israel. Jews have always lived there. There's a Talmud that was written in Israel and so on. So really, Emden is rather dramatic. And the question is, in what ways does he, for instance, reflect his own era of the 18th century? in viewing Jesus as a historical figure rather than a figure of dogma, as, incarnation, Trinity, and so on. He anticipates subsequent Jewish arguments that are quite similar. But he also is reading Jewish tradition, the pre-modern tradition of rabbinic literature and Maimonides and so on. He's reading it selectively. So he ignores the Toldot Yeshu or the Sefer Nitzachon Yashan, the polemical literature that mocks Christianity. You don't see any of that in Emden. And with Maimonides says some good things and some bad things about Christianity, and Emden only repeats the positive. So what interests me is the way in which pre-modern Judaism was a culture of ambiguity. It was able to hold on the one hand, on the other hand, without trying to resolve. But Emden wants to come down clear and say, this is it. This is what we believe. That's it. So that's one element that interests me. And the other is his construction of a third. That is, he wants to form an alliance with the Catholic bishops against the Sabbatians. And that third element in the alliance, that interests me, this question of the third and how it functions. It sort of hovers. And it's true in other kinds of Jewish discussions of other religions. So Heinrich Gretz says good things about Islam. It's a tolerant religion, for example, by which he implies a polemic against Christianity, which is intolerant. So there's this third that functions. And I've been reading with great difficulty, a few articles about thirdness in some psychoanalytic literature, thinking that maybe that would be helpful to apply here. I'm not sure I'll be able to figure it all out. But anyway, I've been struggling with it at my desk this entire day, going a little crazy, and I hope this coming week I can finish it. But that's what I'm working on.
Well, we look forward to hearing more about your new work. Rabbi Daniels, I think, has some questions that have been placed in the chat, and also if there are any questions of anyone here in the sanctuary.
Professor Heschel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a question from Lisa Fingerhunt Carlton, who happens to be the president of our congregation. And she asked that Rabbi Gordon mentioned that HUC and the Reform movement has changed very much over the past 40 plus years since he's been ordained. And we know it'll be different in the next 40 years. With your crystal ball and deep insights, where do you see the most remarkable change or opportunities in our future?
Wow, what a great question. Oh, wow, looking into my crystal ball. So, first of all, I think there will be another Haskalah movement, another Jewish Enlightenment movement. And I think by that I mean a kind of resurgence of intense Jewish creativity and interpretation. The Haskalah was especially interested in the German Haskalah, in biblical Hebrew, in the East European Haskalah, in rationalism and science and philosophy. But it was a movement that raised questions about religious observance and religious belief, fundamental questions that produced fascinating answers. And I think that's important. And another issue that I think will come up, I think that the terrible conflict between Israel and Palestinians is going to be resolved, because the way in which this conflict is leading to suffering in one's life and also loss of life, this cannot continue. And somehow someone is going to find the courage to make a major change. And by that I mean, I do hope the Palestinians will have their own state. I hope it will be a peaceful state. Some of you may be familiar with a new book by Omri Baum, The Republic of Haifa. I don't know, I think that's beyond my own crystal ball, but I hope something like that will happen. The growth of the Haredi community, I think that growth is enormous. But I also think that that will be affected by the coming Haskalah, because I don't think it's entirely sustainable. I think that the Haredi community will have young people more and more wanting to go to college, to explore the world, which is essentially what my father did. He was raised to become another Hasidic Rebbe, but he felt that the world needed something more from him than simply being another Rebbe. And so he felt it was incumbent upon him, morally incumbent, to study at university, to learn the language of the academy of the West, to study philosophy, and with that, to bring Judaism to the world. I do think there is a deep longing for Jewish teachings, and actually also a profound respect for central elements of Judaism, for the prophetic tradition, for example, which I see more and more quoted and studied in books by political scientists, historians, people who understand that there is something about prophecy that speaks to us in important ways. The Sabbath is also extremely respected, and I think people are longing for Shabbat. Christians, Muslims, so-called secular people. So I think that too will change. That is, I think more and more people are going to realize that Shabbat is a great gift of the Jews to the world. So I see actually an elevation. I hope that we as Jews will continue to convey the treasures of our faith and our tradition. And perhaps with all the focus on anti-Semitism, which is important, let's also remember that we have great Jewish teachings, really extraordinary. And the world will be so grateful to hear about them. You pick up a page of a Hasidic text, and it's fantastic, every page. The marvelous ideas about what it is to be a human being in this world. Marvelous. Your life is expanded into a page. They're thrilling. Okay.
Kiki?
I heard Al Franken speak today earlier, and I think he's a man looking for forgiveness by women and other men in the world of politics. Do you see that forthcoming in his case and other politicians who've made disparaging remarks or mistreated women?
What happened to him should not have happened. It was the most dirty of politics. The person who needs to ask forgiveness is Kirsten Gillibrand, who happens to be a Dartmouth graduate, by the way, because she engineered his ouster, and that was horrible. And I don't understand her at all. And I'm waiting for her to ask forgiveness. Al Franken was fooling around as a joke. That was not bad. He didn't assault in any way anybody. He was making a joke. It was inappropriate perhaps in certain circumstances, but when you're a comedian, that I just found that completely disgusting that he was treated this way. So I don't frankly think he has anything to apologize for. I regret not having him in the Congress and the Senate. That's what I regret that deeply, and I felt it was a slap in the face by Gillibrand to me and to every other American, what she did by ousting him. He's really,
Are there more?
I have a lot of respect for him and for what he accomplished, and I hope very much that he has a platform because he has a lot to give us. And I'm waiting for her to apologize.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, Dr. Heschel, you have been a gift to this congregation on many occasions, certainly in your writing, but also in your presence and your willingness to be present for this community. I'm sorry we didn't get further into something that I discussed with you when we had dinner together, that I think that very small book of the Sabbath by your father is one of the most transformational pieces of literature available and around. And that is one of the great gifts that he left us with. But the other great gift he left us with is you.
Thank you.
We value you, appreciate you. I deeply appreciate you as a teacher and a friend. So thank you so much for being here with us on this day to kind of be the first of our guest scholars for this year. It means the world to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I wish I lived in Chicago and could be a member of your congregation. But it was great to be with you, Sam, always. Thank you.
We hope to see you soon in
I
person.
hope you too.
And be well.
Good night. Be well. Bye-bye.